morning, everybody, and welcome to the first Reformed Church Center program of our 22nd year of programs at the Reformed Church Center. It's really nice to be able to be back with you all again. Today is one of our two anti-racism programs for this particular program year, and we're looking at White Christian Nationalism, Liberation Theology, and Being Reformed. As many of you probably recall, after the riots at the U.S. Capitol in January, a senator linked White Christian Nationalism to the theology of Abraham Kuyper, who was a prominent Dutch Reformed theologian. By the way, Kuyper's teachings were also used to justify apartheid in South Africa. And that got lots of people asking the question, well, does that mean that the Reformed Church is in favor of white Christian nationalism? So we thought this would be a good topic for us to be exploring today. Dr. Juan Carmona, who is going to be leading us in this exploration today, is a retired professor of theology. He's served and taught at several schools. He has served as a parish pastor. He has served as a chaplain and worked in a number of roles. He worked for several years at Tainan Theological College and Seminary in Taiwan, teaching courses on liberation theology and prison ministry. He's an ordained minister in the RCA and an alumnus of our favorite theological seminary, as well as the State University of New York and Colgate-Rochester Crozier Divinity School. So we are very, very happy that he's going to be able to be here with us. But first, some greetings from our Vice President for Advancement, Kathy Proctor.
Thank you. Yes, hi. Thank you for giving me a minute to talk about our programs. As James said, my name is Kathy Proctor. I'm the Vice President of Advancement and Recruiting. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that this year is the first year, after COVID, that we are doing all of our programs online. So I think that's something that people don't know about New Brunswick Seminary. All of the programs are available fully online, with our master's program also being able to do in a hybrid model. So if you're in our master's program and you do want to come into the classroom, that is possible. So you can do online and hybrid or just online. So I really felt it was important to let everybody know if you're interested in a theological degree, or I know we have many pastors out there, mentors out there. If you know anybody who's interested in a theological degree, please send them our way. I know Reverend Mann is going to be putting in, you can have anybody reach out to our website under the admissions, the admissions page, as well as you can send an email to admissions, or you can call me directly. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about their call and the programs that New Brunswick Theological Seminary offers. If I could just briefly go over the programs so you know those. We have our degree programs, our master's program, a Master's of Arts in Pastoral Care and Counseling, a Master's of Arts, Theological Studies, Master's of Divinity, and dual degree programs. Now, our Doctor of Ministry degrees have concentrations in missiology and global Christianity, pastoral care and counseling, prophetic urban ministry, and transformational preaching. We also have a non-degree program, which is a certificate program in church leadership and theological studies. So please, if you know anybody who's interested or you're interested yourself, reach out to us. We also do a number of monthly information sessions that you can join. So thank you for your time. Also, I do want to thank everybody who has supported the Reformed Church Center financially. I know many of you have done that, and we appreciate your support to this program as well as any of our future programs. So again, if you're interested in making a donation and supporting the program, the website link is in your chat. Thank you so much.
With all that said, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Juan Carmona.
Thank you. Greetings to all of you in the name of Jesus Christ, the Lord of history. Amen. I also greet you in the name of my African and indigenous ancestors, as well as in the name of all justice-loving and peace-loving people of the world. I thank you, Dr. Brumm, for inviting me to make this presentation. I am truly awed, floored, and honored to receive this invitation to be standing with you and with all my brothers and sisters on holy ground. I request that we take just a minute for a silent reflection as we remember all our sisters and brothers who passed away in the tragic event of 9/11. Let us take a moment for silent reflection. Okay, thank you. We posed the question, can one be a Christian in the Reformed tradition, or for that matter, in any other tradition, and not be a racist? That is a very challenging and complex question to which there are no simple answers. In the words of my theology professor and mentor at New Brunswick Theological Seminary, Dr. Paul Fries, I say, I invite you to adventure. I invite you to risk. And I invite you to celebration. Indeed, we are summoned to remove the sandals from our feet as we enter this sacred space and time, engaging with God and with each other. In order to engage in this discussion, I invite you to consider the following persons and the following movements. John Calvin, who I have always considered the architect of the Reformed faith as we know it today, who lived from 1509 to 1564. Calvin was a French pastor, reformer, and theologian who carried out much of his work in Geneva, Switzerland. He was very active in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. He is known for his doctrinal emphasis on the sovereignty of God and human depravity, which in turn generated the doctrine of election. In other words, that it is God's sovereignty and not human volition that determines the final destiny of human beings, be it eternal life or eternal condemnation. As one follows the teachings of Calvin, one can clearly see that he followed the theological thrust of the Apostle Paul and also of St. Augustine. Another individual, which I'll mention briefly, and of course we will not be spending an inordinate amount of time on him, but because he was influential in Calvinistic theology, I will mention him briefly. Abraham Kuyper, who lived from 1837 to 1920. In addition to having served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905, Kuyper was also a theologian in the Calvinist tradition. Some refer to him as a neo-Calvinist. And he helped establish the Reformed churches in the Netherlands, which, unlike the state-supported Dutch Reformed Church, would not be, in his view, in bed with the government. Now, let's take a look at white Christian nationalism. White Christian nationalism is a story, in a sense, about America. It says that America was founded as a Christian nation by white Christians, and that its laws and institutions are based on biblical, and in parentheses I put Protestant, Christianity. According to the mindset, America is divinely favored. its enormous wealth and power comes from God. In exchange for these blessings, America has been given a mission to spread religion, freedom, and civilization by force if necessary. The mission is endangered by the growing presence of non-whites, non-Christians, and en fin, non-Americans on American soil. White Christians must then take back their country. And for further reference, I mentioned Philip Gorspie in White Christian Nationalism, the deep story behind the Capitol insurrection of published January 22nd, 2021. In our time, we have seen three manifestations of white nationalism, or what I also refer to as white supremacy. One of them is apartheid in South Africa. And for those of us who are familiar with that piece of history, we know that the Dutch Reformed Church used the scriptures and theology to justify, to give theological legitimization to apartheid and segregation in South Africa. The second one, which is a very touchy and sensitive issue, is Zionist expansionism in the Middle East. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the evangelical sector of the church tend to equate Zionism with the promises of God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and justify Zionism on the basis of the Jews being God's chosen people, and therefore they have a right to the land. Well, my friends, I invite you to look at the difference between the biblical theology concerning Israel on the one hand and Zionist expansionism in the Middle East on the other. And when you examine it thoroughly, you will find that Zionist expansionism is another form of white supremacy in the Middle East, legitimized to a certain extent by an evangelical hermeneutic of scripture. And the third form of white supremacy and white nationalism that we have experienced, especially here in the United States, we experienced it for 4 years, was Trumpianism. Donald Trump and his minions and his followers managed to give us a theology that the white race is superior to all other races. The events of January 6th, this past year, were a manifestation of white supremacy, because the insurrection was based on the white lie that the election had been stolen. Trump's white supremacy was revealed and manifested in certain comments that he made. He referred to the immigrants of Central America and Mexico as murderers, rapists, and criminals. And he referred to certain countries of the third world as shithole countries. So we see a lot of racism there coming from the white supremacist perspective. So in turn, we get liberation theology developing in the late 1960s, early 70s in Latin America and among the African-American community in the United States, with the works of the late Dr. James Cone, professor of systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary, and also Dr. Father Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru. I submit personally that liberation theology is not merely another school of thought, but rather a historical movement of God dating back to the time that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. Liberation theology began when God said to Moses, "I have heard the cry of my people and am concerned about them." There is no one theology of liberation. Liberation theology is a richly variegated affair, both in its motifs and in the personalities involved. One will find diversity of thinking and methodology in liberation theology. It is not one particular way of thinking. There is as much diversity in liberation theology as there is in any other theological school of thought. In spite of the diversity which exists, there is an underlying unity. Liberation theology offers us not so much a new theme for theological reflection, but rather a new way to do theology. Theology as critical reflection on historical practice, as a liberating theology, a theology of the liberating transformation of the history of humankind gathered into the church, which openly confesses Christ. This is a theology which is not stopped with reflecting on the world, but rather tries to be a part of the process through which the world is transformed. It is a theology which is open in the protest against trampled human dignity, in the struggle against the plunder of the vast majority of people, in liberating love, and in the building of a new, just, and fraternal society to the gift of the reign of God. Liberation theology is an understanding of the faith and a rereading of the word as it is lived in the Christian community. More than anything, it has to do with the communication of faith and the proclamation of the good news, which is that the Creator loves all humankind. To evangelize is to witness to that love, to say that it has been revealed to us and made flesh. Liberation theology is a critical and committed Christian reflection of the people who have decided to join the struggle, their oppressed people, in contrast to a different society. If liberation theology is made into a new school, it will have its day and be gone. All liberation theologians believe that, number one, theology should emerge from the bottom up and not from the top down. In other words, theology should emerge from those who are alienated, marginalized, and powerless, not from those who are in a position of power. Number two, those who are in a position of powerlessness and subjugation are in a privileged position to understand and participate in God's revelatory acts in history. Number three, oppression and suffering should be the appropriate starting points for biblical interpretation and theological reflection. Is liberation theology in resonance or in contradiction with the theology of Calvin and Kuyper? I have not personally read anything in Calvin's books or in the history of Kuyper that will make them at odds with each other. Liberation theology, like the theology of Paul, St. Augustine, Calvin, and Kuyper, acknowledges the role of God as the initiator and main protagonist of human liberation. The basic paradigm taken from the book of Exodus emphasizes the divine initiative in the emancipation from bondage and oppression. What does liberation theology have to say to white Christian nationalism? Since historically speaking, white Christian nationalism has been one of oppression, operating under the mantra of democracy and civilization and sound doctrine, liberation theology calls into question the basic assumptions and presuppositions of white Christian nationalism. It also deconstructs and demythologizes the ideologies contained in white Christian nationalism. In liberation theology, it is the oppressed and not the oppressors who are favored by God. Gutierrez speaks about God's preferential option for the poor. Liberation theology confronts and denounces the biblical hermeneutics of the white power structure. This presentation is humbly and respectfully submitted to all in the name of the Creator and of the Word and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Juan. I'm so glad that you could be here and share with us today. As I listen to this, and understand I'm not disagreeing with you, but I want to try to play devil's advocate just a little bit. Here you are saying no, liberation theology is what's consistent with Kuyper and Calvin and so forth. But weren't Kuyper and Calvin, and especially Calvin, all in favor of this maintaining of order and the status quo that you talk about with being paired with white nationalism?
It all depends on whether we read Calvin and Kuyper, okay, for themselves, rather than read them through the prism of others, okay? People tend to do with theologians the exact same thing that they do with the Bible, okay? And then other subsequent generations tend to base themselves not on what the Bible says itself, but rather on what people or how people interpret what the Bible says. So it's the same thing with Calvin and Kuyper. I'm not convinced that Calvin, if he had been living in the 20th or 21st century, or even Kuyper for that matter, would have used theological legitimization for white supremacy. I think the emphasis that Calvin and Kuyper had on God's doctrine of election, okay, had more to do with how God acts in history to bring about the redemption of humankind. Naturally, they were both working out of a European context, and to what extent they knew about oppression of other countries outside of Europe is anybody's guess. But I don't think that Calvin and Kuyper themselves would have been in favor of apartheid or of Zionist expansion in the Middle East or Trumpianism.
Okay. I saw a hand briefly go up over among the participants, but then it disappeared. So if you put your hand up accidentally, then don't worry about it. But if you put your hand down accidentally, you might want to try to put it up again. And others who are ready with their questions and comments, I can't see your faces, but I see all the names, and I know that there aren't many shrinking violets among you. So those of you who are ready with your questions and comments, please go ahead and start raising your hands, and I will engage Dr. Carmona a little bit more here. I want to just push on this a little bit more. What does somebody say? You're the pastor of Ninth Reformed Church in Rochester, New York. And I know there's no Ninth Reformed Church in Rochester. It's just a convenient number. Ninth Reformed Church in Rochester, New York. And somebody comes to you and says, well, I was really thinking about joining your church, but I heard that, I heard from a reliable United States senator that you guys are in favor of white nationalism. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I would challenge that person to quote their sources, okay, and try to engage in conversation and say, how do you take the senator's word at face value? Let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, just because a senator or another person in leadership made that kind of statement doesn't necessarily make it absolutely true. Let's discuss it. Let's look at it in its broader implications. And also, let's take a look at what Calvin and Kuyper said in their context.
Okay. Catherine Gordon has posted something in the chat. Does Catherine Gordon wish to talk about it out loud? I can read it for her she went to the top of the list, but her
Sure.
there she is. Okay, go ahead,
Hello,
Catherine.
and thank you so much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed the talk. So my comment was that one evidence-based strategy for reducing racism is to enable people to really get to know one another, and we tend to live in silos. So my question was sort of a reflective one. What can the church do to provide significantly more opportunities to befriend or at least get to know well people who are very different than ourselves?
I think that the church has to engage in honest, rigorous, and serious introspection, number one, and number two, in study, okay? Have seminars, have conferences, have discussions, okay? So that its membership, okay? Its membership, and I'm speaking about the Church Catholic here, the church worldwide, all right? The church worldwide is aware of the issue, because many times as a church, we fall into complacency and we think that things are okay the way they are. We have the attitude of don't rock the boat. Okay, if things are okay, you know, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, I come from the point of view that we don't rock the boat, we flip it or we sink it. Okay, and I don't come from the point of view that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. My point of view is that if it ain't broke, break it. Let's break it. So the church actually has to undergo and undertake serious studies and discussions on the issue of racism. And as I posted in a Facebook message the other day, it's a very, very uncomfortable subject for us as Christians to deal with, because we just can't imagine ourselves being followers of Jesus Christ on the one hand, and on the other hand, holding on to racist attitudes, whether consciously or subconsciously.
Okay. Susan Snyder, would you go ahead and unmute and jump in?
I had just been looking at the question in the chat, but I think that this is very interesting. And the thing that he just said, that Pastor Carmona just said, in regard to having the church understand, we're in the process of trying to do that in our church. And I think that, you know, it's difficult. I think this, even posting this today so that all people could participate if they wanted to, was something that we wanted to do. Besides having reading groups and besides having a working group, to see what our part has been in racism and instigating racism and so forth. But it's a very complex thing, and you know, it's hard to know exactly what to do. So, you know, we're trying, but I think, you know, maybe just having, you know, some group celebrations together, such as Martin Luther King Day, and inviting all the different churches and the different congregations in the neighborhood to that celebration, or to have a celebration for Juneteenth and so forth. I think those are things that we've been thinking about. You know, and perhaps just having, you know, some regular you know, celebration of groups together, you know, some kind of like dinners or some kind of social activities or something like that, where we get to know people on a more social basis, would be good also.
I think that many of these activities are positive and should be commended. Having said that, I would say that we have to go over and beyond that, okay, in terms of addressing structural and systemic issues. I always quote a friend of mine who is a professor at the State University of New York, my friend, Professor Howard Eagle, who says, just because white people smile at you and say good morning doesn't mean that they're not racist, okay? And like I said in my post the other day, just because a white sister or brother says to me, welcome to our church, and hugs me or kisses me after the worship service is over doesn't mean that that person is racist, is not racist. Okay. Racism is a very subtle thing. It exists not only in the minds of white people, but also in the minds of what I would call, for lack of a better term, colonized, psychologically and mentally colonized Black and brown people who buy into the values of the oppressor or of the white power structure.
Okay. Also, Susan, it might be helpful to you as you were talking about how you're working on these things in your congregation. Last January, Earl James did a program with the Reformed Church Center on things a local congregation can do to help become anti-racist. And that recording is on the nbts.edu website, and so you can go there. And if you type Earl James into the search, it should bring up that program for you to be able to look and see that, and even share it with your church leadership. Peter Watts, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Hey, Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Can you talk about the link between Abraham Kuyper and Josh Hawley, the congressman who's pushing like this white Christian nationalism and using Kuyper theology on Christian values being in every facet of our lives, in politics, entertainment, and law and education, etc. Because this seems to be the way in which white Christian nationalism is pushing like law changes that are oppressive under the guise of being a Christian nation.
Correct. Thank you, brother. And, again, one of the problems that we run into is that tendency to make a dichotomy between the spiritual and the secular. Okay, and people who subscribe to that mentality will say, well, we shouldn't be talking about political issues. We should only be talking about spiritual issues. We should be preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. This whole idea of white supremacist ideology, which sometimes embraces Christian theology, it almost gives the impression that anything theologically speaking which comes out of Euro-America, okay, is universally valid, okay, universally legitimate in all times and in all places. So basically, the major issue that we're dealing with here, brother, is that a lot of us, okay, and when I say a lot of us, when I say us, I'm including many of my Black and brown sisters and brothers. We have actually brought into this that the theology which was brought to us by the Euro-American missionary enterprise, both Catholic and Protestant, okay, is the right way to go, that we have to subscribe to it because God has used the white power structure to bring us the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when we look at that in a historical and serious theological perspective, we find that what has happened is that there's actually been a distortion of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is really all about. In evangelical theology, there's a strong emphasis on individualism, okay, an individual relationship with God, and the notion that individuals have a pipeline to heaven or pipeline to God, so to speak. Okay, and even in the African American and Latino community, people have brought into that. Okay, and not so much because it comes directly from the scripture itself, but because it comes from a white biblical and theological hermeneutic.
Okay, Peter, anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay, glad to have you. Glad to have you here with us. For those who don't know, Peter, what is your official title? I have trouble keeping track of titles at the GSC these days. Peter? Okay, Peter has muted himself, and so maybe isn't going to answer that fun question.
Yes. I didn't know I was muted. Okay. Thank you. My current position in the RCA, I am the supervisor for advocacy and race relations. It's a new office that's being established.
Yes. But functionally, he kind of steps into the place where Earl James was for many years. So we're really glad to have Peter doing that work among us, and keeping all of us honest. I'm going to try to at least give some folks who've been posting things in questions or in the chat a little chance to speak up. It would be really much more helpful if you'd raise your hands, because then I'd know where you were. Reginald Smith, would you like to speak out loud, or do you want me to read your question for you? There's Reginald, so I'm going to invite him. There he goes.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm in the Christian Reformed Church. I'm the parallel to Peter Watts. So my question is, well, as you think about, sometimes I think sociology trumps theology, and how would you compare today's Trumpism to what was happening during the Civil War, where the Confederacy based a lot of their theological vision on slavery? And today, Trumpism based its theological vision on really racial hierarchy and caste. What would you say to that?
Right. I'm not sure that I would make an exact corollary between Trumpianism and the Confederacy, even though obviously there are a lot of similar elements. Going back to a statement that I made before, when Trump criminalized, people who came from Latin America, especially Mexico and Central America, and even from the Caribbean, and he referred to these immigrants as criminals, murderers, and rapists, and then referred to their countries as shithole countries. We see a lot of contempt coming from Trump and from those who Trump is associated with. And a lot of people who brought into it, just thought of Trump as being God's anointed. I mean, they would do ridiculous things like even quoting scripture, trying to prove that Trump was God's anointed by quoting scriptures by saying things such as the trumpet shall sound. And they make a connection between those scriptures and the coming of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, a lot of my African American and Latinx sisters and brothers, and I'm sure also in some Native American and Asian American communities, there was the notion that, that Trump is, like I put in a post a few years ago, that Trump is God's dude, so to speak. I just don't understand for the life of me, however, that how is it that people could be so naive and gullible as to even begin to think in terms of someone who is so racist and so obnoxious, being God's anointed, and just trying to do everything to keep him in power. And I'm sure that there are people in the church who believe the white lie, and who in their own way support what happened on January 6th, and if not totally embrace it, but at the very least minimize it by saying that it was trespassing and not an insurrection.
Okay. Lydia Rodriguez Menzel, would you go ahead and unmute?
Yes. Hi. I just had a quick question with regard to the way possibly that we could use liberation theology to respond to those Christians who maintain that systemic racism does not exist.
Okay. Liberation theology, and thank you, Sister Lydia, it's good to hear from you. Liberation theology addresses structural and systemic issues. It gets away from this thing of doing things like, racist attitudes of individuals. Liberation theology focuses on structural and systemic racism, not individual racism. And I think that when we examine things structurally, when we examine things systemically, especially here in the United States, it's difficult not to realize that racism is not a thing of the past, especially systemic and institutional racism. I think when you look at the dominant power structure, okay, even though we have to deal with the issue of tokenism, okay, so we have a few blacks, we have a few Latinx people, we have a few Asian American, we have a few Native American, but the mentality still remains the same. And many times, a lot of these people who achieve certain positions, okay, professionally and educationally, buy into the notion that white is right, okay, and in a sense buy into the notion that if you're white, okay, you're all right. If you're brown, you can stick around, and if you're black, you go to the back. Even people in our own oppressed communities tend to believe that. I'll give you an example, and some of you are Spanish speaking or may have had experience with the Spanish speaking churches, especially the Spanish speaking Pentecostal churches. There is a song which is sung in many of the Hispanic churches. It's called El Rubio de Galilea, the blonde man of Galilee. Okay, and every time I hear that song, I cringe because it makes reference to El Rubio de Galilea, the blonde man of Galilee. And I ask myself, who in tarnation ever told anybody that Jesus Christ is blonde or blue-eyed, you know, for that matter? So I cringe every time I hear these kinds of things. So to get back to Sister Leah's question, I really don't think that we can say that racism is something that just exists from one individual to another. There is individual racism, but individual racism does not in any way obliterate institutional, structural, and systemic racism.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Dr. Carmona, nobody had to tell a lot of us that Jesus was blonde and blue-eyed because there were pictures hanging in our churches for years and years while we were growing up.
Exactly.
Painted in the 40s and 50s that showed him being just that. You have lots of friends clearly in the audience, but a couple of them share your last name, and so I'm going to invite Jessica Carmona to speak.
I think she's my daughter.
Jessica, could you go ahead and unmute and speak? Oh, okay. Hang on. I've got to do something here. Okay, Jessica, you should be able to now.
Hi, Jess. I can't hear you.
Hi. Okay. Hello.
Hi, Jess.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. It's very inspiring and educational. I had raised my hand a while ago in response to, I believe, Catherine Gordon's question about what we can do concretely to, break down racism. And I think it's a little bit more than getting to know each other better. And other people have spoken to this, but I think it's a more active approach, right? That white people, in my opinion, should be very proactive in acknowledging the role that their ancestors have played in the oppression of non-white people. And as was hinted at, it's very uncomfortable at times, and not a fun thing to do. But I think that if you want to make people feel comfortable, I think the first step in that direction would be like, listen, I'm aware that I'm white and that my ancestors are responsible for a lot of the conditions that people of color face today. And, I have several colleagues who have their email signature with something similar, like a 2 or 3 liner, like, I acknowledge that I am part of blah, 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 who oppressed the Native American people. So, it's not a matter of staying stuck in the past or reliving the past, but I think if we acknowledge the atrocities of the past, we can learn from it and we can move forward from there. But not in the sense that we're just here to make certain groups of people feel more comfortable and relieve their guilty conscience, but that we actually care. We acknowledge there was very systematic wrongdoing for a long time, and that a lot of the situations that we're dealing with today are directly connected to the systemic oppression that has existed in this country for centuries. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So thank you again for not only the presentation, but all the wonderful comments that I'm hearing and I'm seeing in the chat.
Thank you, Jessica, for your comment. Yeah, and that's what I meant when I said before that we have to go over and beyond doing, potluck get-togethers between, whites and blacks. Those things are good in and of themselves. It goes over and beyond that, though. We have to be very, very serious and engage in honest introspection.
Noah, I'm hoping I get the last name right. Cruz? Noah?
Cruz is how you say it.
Ah, okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Carmona, for this presentation. I'm wondering if you could address the idea that white Christians tend to look at racism as an external concern that impacts people of color rather than an internal issue that affects them, that misshapes their humanity, their behaviors. I'm thinking about how the theology of predestination may make white Christians think that they are already okay, while people of color are not in yet. They need to be fixed, helped, saved by the goodness of whiteness, and just how toxic that might be for white Christians and white churches.
Thank you, brother. I think that one of the major problems there is that when we tend to think of racism as something external and not internal, okay, we're brushing things under the table. Okay, or under the rug, so to speak. Okay, because if you point out that it's internal as well as external, of course, then we have to deal with ourselves. We have to really look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, am I really racist? And if I am, I don't like what I see in myself. So what I have to do is then I have to externalize it, okay, project it externally. And one of the ways that it's projected externally sometimes is to accuse blacks and brown people of counter racism. And one of the things that I do in terms of deconstructing and demythologizing counter racism is to say that there's no such thing as counter racism if we define racism as the belief that one's race is genetically, morally, and spiritually superior to all other races. True that many people in the oppressed community, especially in the African American, the Latino, the Asian American, and the Native American First Nations community hate white people, okay, because of the oppression that has been heaped upon them. But I have never heard anything coming from either of these oppressed communities that we need to have a nation, that we need to do nation building on the basis of Black people or Latin American people or First Nations people or Asian American people, putting white people into a position of subserviency and playing a secondary role in society. There's talk about liberation from white power structures, but I have really never heard people of color speaking about flipping the script, so to speak, in such a way that white people play a secondary role.
Okay. Ruth Ayala Carmona.
Thank you. So I wanted to address our sister who beautifully stated or questioned in terms of ideas or ways that one can reach the communities of color as a white person and from the church's perspective. And unfortunately, too many times what I've seen is that with good intent, we create a lot of committees, we decide to create celebrations within the church, but we have to start looking at, well, if we do that, where are these churches located? Often they're nowhere near where our brown and Black communities are. And so what we do is we kind of spin these wheels that are not really reaching the people that they intend to reach. Racism is a heart issue. And that has to be acknowledged. And I would like to see more of an intent where they go into these communities. Like, I don't want you to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King, a Latin particular holiday in your arena. I would like you to come and sit with me in my arena and begin to get to know who I am and how the structures that have been there and have existed for so long have affected me in particular. And I'm saying that as a community. And so there's been a lot of good intent, but it's been within the church walls. And I would like to see that expanded out into the communities where you sit with the folks that are being affected or have been affected horribly for so long by this oppressive system.
Right. There has to be intentionality in there, because many times we say things, basically, and it just remains in the realm of lip service, but there has to be intentionality. And we have to go over and beyond this. Oh, well, one of my best friends is Black. Okay. And we have to go over and beyond, guess who's coming for dinner? Those kinds of statements like that. We have to be more intentional. I know, for example, in the church that Ruth and I attend here in Raleigh, North Carolina, we've been members for a little over 12 years now at the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. Okay, it's a predominantly Caucasian church, predominantly white middle class church, and in general, church where we have a good positive relationship with the people there. Okay, but we can also sense that some people will feel very uncomfortable if you were to get a horde of Latino or African American people coming to worship on any given Sunday morning. They will say, what's happening here? Are we being invaded? Are we going to lose our church the way we knew it to be? And, in all fairness, I would almost venture to think that the same thing would happen with predominantly African American or Latino churches. I remember the church that I grew up in Staten Island, New York, the White Christian Church, which is a predominantly Puerto Rican Pentecostal church. When we brought up the idea of doing services in English for the youth, the pastor and the leaders were saying, well, we can't do this because the Americans are going to take over that. So in the church, we have to be very, very serious and honest about what is it that we want and how can we achieve that goal, okay? And why do we feel uncomfortable with the subject of racism? How far are we going to let this subject go? Are we going to table it for a rainy day and talk about other things like potluck, the budget, and so on and so forth?
Okay, Peter Twinkle.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Carmona, for the presentation. One of the things I've discovered being here in the Caribbean from a few sources now is that the Dutch version of slavery was among the most brutal when you compare their methods to the French or Spanish or Danish. And so I've wondered for a long time if there's something wrong with our theology, that it's producing bad fruit, and to what extent the theology needs to change. And the more I read about like decolonial thinking, the more they encourage people to get rid of the terms rather than just change the content of the conversation. So on the one hand, we could talk about God's sovereignty and penal substitution in more communal and less individualistic terms, but they might suggest we just get rid of the terms altogether and start over, because our way of thinking is producing the bad fruit. So I'm just wondering if there are terms you think we shouldn't use or shouldn't teach in our seminaries or churches anymore that are part of the Reformed tradition.
Thank you for that question, brother. Yeah, it reminds me also of the controversy that we have of people trying to get rid of critical theory or the critical race theory, okay, because it's too uncomfortable, it's too unnerving in many cases. I'm not sure that there's satisfactory, for lack of a better term, satisfactory alternative terms. I mean, theology, just like pastoral work, is not intended to make people feel comfortable. I'll use a phrase that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, okay? Our task is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, okay? And I think that theology has to be very intentional and very deliberate, okay, in making people feel uncomfortable. We have to actually ruffle people's feathers, like the prophets of the Old Testament and John the Baptizer and Jesus himself did. Because many times we want to, like, you know, sit back and say, oh, I don't want to say that because, you know, people will then feel offended. People will feel uncomfortable. Well, damn it, we've been feeling uncomfortable for over 500 years with your oppression. So maybe it's time for you to start feeling a little bit of the pain that, you know, we've been feeling. Okay, and not that we want to be, you know, torturous or that we want to be sadistic on you, but, you know, we need to level the playing field.
Okay. Samuel Cruz.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Dr. Carmona. Thank you for your presentation this morning.
Hi, Dr.
You mentioned earlier that Calvin, like many historical figures, has been, I guess, incorrectly represented, at least their views, like we've done to all major figures, including Jesus. But what can we do to make more emphasis or have more emphasis on the positive contributions that people like John Calvin had on social and economic issues? Many years ago, I worked on a small project with Dr. Well, now I forgot his name, but he was the author of the Theology of Revolution. And we worked on a project on Calvin and liberation theology. And I read a book that he recommended to me by Andre Bierlaire on the social and economic humanism of John Calvin. And one of the things that stuck to me in reading that, among many things, was that in Calvin's Geneva, if anyone mistreated immigrants, they would be in legal trouble. In other words, so I'm thinking here as you speak, what can our country learn about the treatment of immigrants from a theological and Christian perspective from John Calvin? So how can we do something to correct those misrepresentations of historical figures?
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. And let me answer your question, first of all, by saying that I think that you yourself will be in a better position to answer that question, because I've always considered you to be an expert on Calvinism and on the theology of Kuyper. But taking it over, you know, a little further, okay, I think that we need to invite people to not only look at what Calvin and Kuyper said, but what other theologians are saying, okay, and make a comparison, because many times we tend to get stuck on Calvin, on Kuyper, on Barth, on Bultmann, and it's okay to be familiar with them. I mean, Dr. James Cone, who was a professor at Union Theological Seminary for many years, he was very, very thoroughly immersed in European theology, okay, and that's why he was able to develop, okay, the theology from an African-American standpoint. So I think that we need to invite Christians and non-Christians, for that matter, okay, to study not only theology in its European historical perspective, but also theology as it has emerged and developed from the third world, you know, especially getting into Latin American liberation theology, African American liberation theology, womanist and feminist theology. Okay, we need to have people engage, okay, engage seriously with the different theological mindsets and movements that we are seeing in our time. I can't hear you. Dr. Brumm, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Young Kim, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. This is the issue to how to reflect your argument, I mean, the white nationalism or the white Christian nationalism into for the life of the still oppressed, I mean, in this social economic situation. I think such a white nationalism or white supremacy, such a reality has been accelerating the economic depravity. I mean, such indifference, the distribution gap or wealth or something like that, and pushing the oppressed still into the hopeless social economic classism. So, Dr. Carmona, how do you extend your argument into such an economic issue of the modern capitalism for the still oppressed people?
Thank you, my brother, for bringing that. It's a very important question because one of the things that liberation theology, especially from a Latin American standpoint, okay, does is it identifies, in a sense, the economic system known as capitalism as being at the root, okay, of the problem. Okay, so we're dealing with class issues, we're dealing with issues of race. So, for example, James Cone, okay, coming from the African American liberation theology perspective, does not emphasize class as much as he does race. Latin American theologians, on the other hand, focus more on the socioeconomic issue, especially on the economic issue. And that's why, to a certain extent, many Latin American theologians have been classified as Marxists in disguise, because anytime that there's talk about socialism, okay, right away we get what we call in Spanish, el cuco, the boogeyman. Okay, and they say, oh, we can't include liberation theology in our conversation because then the communists are going to infiltrate the church and take it over. Okay, so to answer your question, my brother, I think that we need to see how is it that liberation theology addresses economic issues. There's one particular book that I would recommend. It's called Marx and the Bible, where Jose Porfirio Miranda looks at the corollary between the scriptures, okay, and what we could call, for lack of a better term, socialist economics. So I think that if we're going to do theology, we have to deal seriously with social, economic, as well as with political and class issues.
Okay. Mark Ennis, come on down.
How are you, Juan? Haven't seen you in years.
Yes, brother Mark. It's good to hear from you.
Good to see and hear from you too. I would like to hear your comments on the very popular book from Dumais now, Jesus and John Wayne.
Wow. I think somebody mentioned a little while ago that I had not mentioned it, and quite frankly, I have not read that book yet. So I really am not in a position to make any comment on that.
Guy, I would ask you to read it. I think it's an amazing summary of how white Christians linked up with the evangelical movement and civil religion, all to have a great Christian white boys club. And I'd love to hear you comment after reading it. I ask you to do that, please.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Pastor Mark. Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to do that. And if Dr. Brumm invites me to talk next year, I'll be sure to bring some comments on that.
Then I will ask Dr. Brumm to invite you next year to bring comments on it. Please do so, Dr. Brumm.
Okay.
Let's see. Maybe we can talk to the author and to Dr. Carmona and have a Jesus and John Wayne session for next year's
that would be
program.
Great.
I think that could be really interesting.
Yes.
Thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you, Pastor Mark.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. George Coniglio.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to see this happen. These are efforts that bring us together. Informative. Nice to meet you, Pastor Juan, in person, so to speak. And really great to be here. The question is, like, what is said is so inspiring. It's truth. But the question is this: what are the basics of being an effective ally? Now, I've seen some people make the attempt with great intention, but like, oh no, that's not what you should be saying, and let other people take the lead, and just listen. Really important to listen. So, what are some other aspects of being an effective ally to our cause here, which is to embrace people, to build bridges, and to reach out?
Great question, Pastor George, and I thank you for it. The thing that occurs to me every time I hear, that question or related questions is that we Christians, as much as we tend to be very reticent or hesitant to do so, need to think seriously in terms of making alliances and linkages with people who are not necessarily Christian, but who are committed to social justice and who are committed to dismantling the structures of injustice. I think that if we acknowledge that they in their own way are doing the work of God, okay, that we might be more effective in establishing linkages with them, okay, without requiring them to subscribe to, a Christian creed or to Christian theology. I don't think that God wants us to say, okay, well, why don't you hook up with that group, but first try to convert them into Christians? No, I don't think so. I think that we need to actually make alliances and linkages with people who are seriously committed to justice-loving and peace-loving people all over the world. I think that Martin Luther King is a perfect example of that.
Thank you.
Peter Watts.
Thank you again. Going back to, I think, Peter Twinkle, as he was talking about thinking about theology and maybe changing or going back and rethinking some of the, so when I think about Reformed theology, and when I first came into the RCA and learning about Reformed theology, the first thing that I was taught was tulip, the whole tulip. And I've always wondered, with starting with total depravity, if that in turn leads to just this faulty thinking and practice, in that if we start with total depravity versus starting with God's good creation and in the image of God, and people being created in the image of God, that we start with total depravity, and so we immediately see people of color, marginalized people, as people who immediately need to be fixed and saved, and so our behaviors then result in that. So if I am a missionary, domestic missionary, for example, and I come into a urban community as a missionary, the first thing I think before I think of being made in the image of God, I'm thinking these are savages, or these are lost people, or these are that. And so I engage them in that way versus engaging them in the way of, oh, this is an image bearer, and so my relationship towards them is in that vein versus in the vein of starting with total depravity. And so I've just often wondered that. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yes, I think that when that element of condescension or paternalism sets in, which is basically characteristic of the missionary enterprise, especially on the Protestant side in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. If we come from a Reformed perspective with a strong emphasis on human depravity, especially if we rely on Calvin, Kuyper, St. Augustine, and the Apostle Paul, I think a more appropriate way would be to acknowledge that we ourselves, as Christians, participate, okay, or have been affected by that human depravity that we talk about. So I can't go to a third world country or to any country for that matter and treat these people as people who have been affected by sin without acknowledging that I myself have been affected by sin. Okay, when Ruth and I were going to Taiwan in 2016, people were saying, "Oh, we're so glad for you because you're going to bring Christ over there." And my response to that was, "No, no, no, no. We're not going to bring Christ over there. Christ is already there. Okay, we're going to share. We're going to have an exchange, okay, of our experiences of Christ being there and Christ working through the power of the Holy Spirit to help us overcome our human depravity. But to think that our Taiwanese brothers and sisters are depraved and we're not, I think that's living in theological la-la land."
Thank you. And then my last question is, as we think about seminaries and we think about what we're teaching in our seminaries and centering essentially like white theology or thinking, or where liberation theology or feminist or woman, those seem to be electives that we get to take on the side versus what we consider to be like mainline theological thoughts. So how do we change that in the institution to where if we, where liberation theology, feminist theology, womanist theology can be centered as well versus being an elective we just get to learn about on the side or not part of the main syllabus when you look at recommendation or books that must be read?
It's interesting that you asked that question because when I was a student at New Brunswick Seminary back in the 70s, I was constantly raising that same question that third world and liberation theologies were being treated not only as electives, but also as an appendix, as not important, okay, to Western theology. And one of the professors said to me, "Well, this is a Western institution." I says, "Yeah, but we're living here in the West, okay, and we are, in a sense, suffering and experiencing the effects of what you Western people have done to us. So why do you want to continue putting third world theology, okay, theology of the oppressed, as an appendix to traditional theology?" And that's another example of how white supremacy is still existent, consciously or non-consciously, even in theological institutions.
Thank you.
I'd like to chime in because I'm guessing that certainly at New Brunswick, if you took the Foundations of Theology course now, you'd probably get more liberation theology and womanist theology than you might be expecting. And I did also wanted to say, I'd be interested to know who decided to bringing you up to speed with Reformed theology meant teaching you tulip. Because Matthew Van Maastricht, who teaches at New Brunswick, and Suzanne McDonald, who teaches at Western, would both, because I've heard them do it, both decry how tulip really has nothing to do with the canons of Dort and certainly doesn't accurately reflect Calvinism. And if you want to hear them do that in their own words, there's another nice recording that we had from 2019 where we celebrated the anniversary of the end of the Synod of Dort. And you can find that again at nbts.edu. William Edkins. William, are you still with us? There
Yes,
he is.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, my good friend Tony.
Hey, Bill.
Thank you very much for your talk here and your thoughts, Tony. And I'm sorry, to me, he's Tony. I've known him since junior high, and we've grown up together. So, but anyway, your talk has really stimulated my thinking, and of course, my background, I'm a psychologist. And so I've been listening as you've been talking, kind of with that ear. And your comments and especially Jessica's comments too about guilt really grabbed my attention. And I just wanted to say a couple of perspectives here from a psychological point of view and get your feedback on what you think of this, Tony. But the capacity for guilt developmentally is one of the key developments in human relationships. And it's basically the capacity to own how I've hurt somebody else versus to project or deny it. And I see it in marriage counseling all the time. You know, when a person comes in, a couple comes in, and one of them is trying to say how they've been hurt, immediately what the partner will often do is to attack the person who's saying they've been hurt. Like, well, you're too sensitive, or, you know, oh, you say that all the time. You know, we've all seen this kind of thing. But that's what I'm talking about, is that capacity to feel empathy for the person I've hurt. That's so crucial in any relationship. And then, of course, taking that societally. Here's what I want to get at, Tony, and get your thoughts. That I never had this thought till right today when you were talking, but I think white supremacy is a defense against guilt. See, I think we all carry profound guilt about slavery. How I'm sitting here in California. I mean, this land isn't my land. I own a house here, but you know, this was a Native Americans' land that was taken from them many years ago. Even you know, the whole idea of dirty jobs. You know, all the people that are working, being exploited so I can have the quality of life I have. There's guilt there. And I think white supremacy, instead of feeling that guilt, turns around and devalues the very people that we've hurt. You see, it's a defense against feeling guilt. And just one last comment that I think many of you have talked about. Well, what do we do in our churches? And, you know, and I hear sincere efforts to want to do something about this. And I think the bottom line is that facing guilt can impact us. And when we're impacted, that changes how we live and how we relate. You know, owning that, you know, the person that washes my car, they don't have enough money. They're working all day. They don't have enough money to support their family. And here they're washing my car. How to be impacted by that, you know, and even practically, like, what kind of tip do I leave them, knowing that this poor person, you know, isn't going to have enough money to feed his family on the money he's making. So I just wanted to get your ideas on that, Tony, and thank you, because it's a very creative space. I never had some of these ideas before.
Thank you, Dr. Bill, Dr. William Atkins, as we call him, Bill. Okay, we're friends since junior high school and high school, and I think it's an important question. And in that same vein, I wonder if theology and doctrine itself is a buffer zone between our guilt and the people, okay, who are suffering, the people who are oppressed. I'm wondering if theological systems are designed, or created and designed to separate us from people, okay, especially from people who don't look like us, either racially or in terms of social, economic class. And I'm wondering if, in a sense, theology is, in a sense, a defense mechanism to deal with our own guilt. Dr. Atkins brings up a very, very important point. Okay, is theology really nothing but a defense mechanism to keep us segregated and separated from other people who we consider ourselves, who we consider them to be, in a sense, inferior to us spiritually and morally speaking? And I think that in the same way that psychology deals with this internalized human guilt, I tend to think that theology, in a sense, does the same thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
By the way, I just want to say for the record, you heard Dr. Atkins refer to me as Tony, and that's because of my middle name, Antonio. So my friends and my family always call me Tony.
Good to know. Catherine Gordon left a comment in chat and asked me to share it. Part of the underbelly of racism may be the fixed pie mentality. The often unspoken concern that if white people share power, resources, good jobs, etc., with people of color, then white people will have less. Racism may be a form of selfishness, and probably, this is difficult to do while running Zoom. Racism may be a form of selfishness and probably always has been. What can the church do to address this?
Okay, I think again we need to deal with economics. Okay, are we trying to build a nation where people have less than others, or are we trying to build a nation where basically everybody has access to the good of the land? And unfortunately, the church, and not only the white church, but also to a certain extent the African American and the Latino church, and I can say more about them than I can say about the Asian American or the First Nations churches, have brought into this idea that capitalism is the way to go, and that if people are poor, it's because they're lazy. If people are not working, it's because they're lazy. They don't want to get off their duffs, okay, to find a job. And we tend to fall into that syndrome of blaming the victim. All right. And I think that the church has to have forums and discussions as to what kind of an economic system do we need to develop so that there's full equality, and not have a system where you have this wide gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay. Another comment from Regina Brannick, who wishes she could do this in her own voice, but she said her own voice is not working very well this morning. Us natives were made to go to Christian schools away from our families, and we were made to speak only English. If those kids who were heard speaking in their own language, they were punished. How is that being Christian like Christ? I heard an RCA delegate in a meeting a couple of years ago say that we needed to keep the Hispanics out of our country by building a wall, and the RCA needed to support building that wall. Again, how is that Christ-like?
Well, that interesting thing about building the wall, it's just so reminiscent of a person who said that when he assumed the presidency 4 years ago. We're not about building walls, okay? As a matter of fact, theologically speaking, we should be in the task of tearing down the walls, and not tearing down the walls in the sense that Ronald Reagan spoke about it to Mikhail Gorbachev, but breaking the walls of segregation, breaking down the walls of all those things that alienate us from one another and tend to make us think in terms of, us versus them. Dr. Atkins, who spoke a few minutes ago, okay, he and I talk about this quite a bit, not only in terms of, let's say, races and ethnic groups or cultural groups, but also in terms of us versus them, the church versus the world, the saved versus the unsaved, the elect versus the non-elect. Okay, we build these walls, and then we become so arrogant and so presumptuous as to think that God has favoritism with us, and that God holds people who don't think or look like us in contempt. Liberation theology addresses that and denounces it vehemently.
I don't see any more hands raised. And we are just about at the end of what we had said was the intended time. Do you have any last word you want to share with us today, Dr. Carmona?
No, thank you so much, Dr. Brumm, for this invitation. Again, I consider it an honor and a great privilege to be engaging with our sisters and brothers here today. And I thank you again, for this invitation. It's been very wonderful.
Okay. And thank you all for being here with us. I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I hope you have a good time in prayer over the next couple days, thinking about this difficult anniversary that comes this weekend, and that your ministries are going well. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Brumm.
Thank you, Dr. Carmona.